Your English is wonderful.
Yeah, that was good.
Very good.
Next year will be perfect.
Next month. All right, so let's get started. I want to start with a quick synopsis of the case. It was Columbia's final mission. So during takeoff, a piece of foam had fallen off or something. Some kind of debris fell off and hit and broke off a large piece of foam from the craft. That had happened lots of times on previous missions. They had at first called it a severe problem, and they had tried to check into it, but then as more missions happened and the foam fell off, they just kind of decided it was fine and it was an acceptable flight risk. However, in this case, it appeared that it was a much larger piece of foam that had fallen off than in prior cases, but they didn't have good images because the cameras that are set up at the launch site, there have been budget cuts and they hadn't spent a lot of funding on them, so the cameras weren't very good, didn't give them good pictures. They didn't put together a Tiger team as they had when Apollo 13 had problems. Instead, they created the DAT team, and the DAT was supposed to investigate this and make sure it was fine, but they didn't really make anything clear as far as who they reported to. They didn't put them directly in contact with mission control. So when the DAT team requested to have better images, they weren't able to follow proper protocols. They found some people who could put in the request, but because those requests didn't follow the proper protocols, the requests were canceled. And they did some analysis using, I forget the name of the thing. Do you guys remember the name of the...
Carter. It was Carter.
Yes, that's it. They used that to try to figure out some scenarios, decide if it was okay, but the program wasn't really designed well, and it didn't really take into account a lot of the things that actually happened. So it didn't give them really good data, and they weren't very convincing when they give their presentations because they weren't able to run all of the simulations, and there were so many variables that were unaccounted for. So it was decided that it was an acceptable flight risk. The engineers were upset because they felt like nobody was taking them seriously. They felt like they weren't allowed to go against the norm because NASA had this idea of prove to me something's wrong, and there was no real hard facts and data proving that there was a problem. And so the Columbia, when it came back in and made its descent, it did explode and lost the lives of all 7 crew members. Anything that we should add to the synopsis that you guys remember that I left out?
No, pretty good. Very good.
And then, so in our discussion, the first question is just, what is the issue?
Well, I would say they had a definite problem of one hand not knowing what the other hand's doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely organizational problems with the teams not knowing who to communicate and not being connected really well.
I think there was a lot of buck passing, too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nobody wanted to admit there was a problem, it seemed like. And those who did weren't taken seriously. Mm-hmm. So it talks about, oh wait, I'm jumping ahead. So it says, why is it important to know what the issue is? Why is it, it's a weird question. Why is it important to research this problem with the foam? Why would that be an important thing to do?
To save the lives of the crew that's going up in space.
Yeah, true.
Their lives are dependent on it. It's like jumping into the car and not taking a thought about if the brakes are good or not.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, the car will drive pretty good, but will it stop? Yeah. So then it says we should talk about the recovery window. It says a recovery window is the time period between a threat and a major accident or prevented accident in which collective action is possible. So what was the recovery window in this case?
16 days.
Yeah, short period of time. All right, so this next section I think is going to be the bulk of our discussion, and it's really interesting. It's talking about downplaying ambiguous threats, right? So it's all this psychological terms in this part to talk about why is it that we as humans kind of tend to downplay things that can be a serious problem. And so it's talking about human cognitive biases. Are either of you guys familiar with those?
Well, I'm familiar with what the words mean.
Oh, okay. So it says in here that it's systematic errors in judgment, and our tendency in confirmation bias is our tendency to look for information that confirms our existing views. Right? So it talks about how that's going on with this case, right? They're wanting to confirm that their views are correct, that there's not a problem, that everything's fine.
Well, I think the great example in this case of that, and I'm trying to look it up now in my pages of highlights. I'm sorry, but I can't seem to find the passage. But they got two other people talking, and, these are people that should be taking charge of making the repair. And one of them says he does not want to be the Chicken Little on this situation. He doesn't want to be the alarmist. He doesn't want to be the one that causes everyone to panic and try to come up with a remedy. And, it's a mentality like that of, I don't even want to pull the safety cord, that I think a lot of these people have, and ended up dooming the astronauts to a fiery death.
Yeah. It's interesting, in my reading discussion group for this class, there's a girl in my group who, she said that as she was reading this, she was reminded of her personal life, that she had migraines. A lot of people get migraines, so she didn't think about it. She started falling occasionally and just thought, oh, I'm just being clumsy or whatever. And there were all these little things that happened that she just kind of wrote off because she thought it wasn't a big deal. And so she didn't seek medical attention or anything. And then she had something fairly catastrophic happen, and so she did go into the hospital, and it turned out she had a brain injury condition. It was a genetic predisposition, and there was, I don't remember all the details, but so she had this problem with her brain that was a serious problem. But all the little symptoms that had led up to it, she had written off as, oh, it was just normal, not a big deal. And it ended up putting her in this life-threatening situation, and she was able to have brain surgery, and she's fine today. But she said, sometimes we look at things and we just accept them as normal, right, when they're not normal, because they're just little things that happen as they go, and we don't realize how big they are. And I appreciated her perspective because I hadn't thought about that with this case, but I think it's true that in this case, they'd had once happen and thought, oh, maybe we should check that out. But when it kept happening and was fine, they just wrote it off. So I just wonder, how often do we do that in our lives where we just kind of think something's normal when it's actually a problem?
Well,
I think the NASA Foundation committed, I think, three serious mistakes. I think the first error, the first mistake, is that NASA decided that storm shedding was not a serious risk and never investigate this problem. Error is that about 1 minute and 22 seconds after the launch, the left wing of Columbia was damaged, and NASA not seen this as a risk, ignored the demands of engineers to further analyze this impact. I think there is a third error. I think the third error is even more serious because NASA has ignored, this is only my opinion, but NASA has ignored the problem to give in the political from the Congress. Space mission was focused on the construction of the International Space Station, and NASA was under pressure and to finish it in time. But in this case, NASA how can I say, underestimate. In my opinion, there was a time when space missions had become almost habitual, I think. And this has perhaps induced NASA to underestimate many risks. Indeed, it was not the first time that a space mission would end badly. I remember another space mission in which the spacecraft immediately exploded during the launch.
The Challenger.
Yes. I think really there was a period of time that many risks was underestimated. Become habitual. The space mission was an habitual mission. I think.
I think you're absolutely right. I was really, as I was reading this, comparing the Apollo 13 mission with this mission. And in Apollo 13, it was back in the 60s, and so space travel was very new, and it was very, people understood the risks and were very concerned about it. And so as soon as they saw there was a problem, immediately the purpose of the mission was set aside, and the new purpose was to get these guys home safely. And everything surrounded that. And I feel like with this one, with the Columbia, they were so focused on the mission and what they wanted to do and keeping their schedule that became more important than realizing the risks, because people had been up in space, they'd have a lot of flights, and so they kind of started to ignore all the risk involved with it. And so when this came up, they didn't prioritize it. They were more focused on the actual mission and what they wanted to accomplish than thinking about the safety and the lives of the crew.
Yeah, I think the thing that I find most frustrating in this story of the Columbia is the fact that they intentionally never told the crew that the ship was damaged.
Mm-hmm.
If they had told the crew that the ship was damaged, the crew might have been able to do something, at least get pictures to send the engineers on the ground. It would have been easy for the crew to walk out on the wing or something and take a few pictures.
Mm-hmm.
But by not telling the crew, they kept them in the dark, prevented any repairs, prevented any assessments. And, frankly, if the crew had known, they could have just docked the ship at the space station and gone to the space station for until they could send up another rocket to collect them.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't think about that. You're absolutely right. That would have been an easy fix. They could have completed their mission and then just waited out there. You know, they could have launched another ship that was safe, another shuttle, let them complete the mission, but then have them come back in a different shuttle. What an easy solution. Sad. So we kind of talked about the next question. So then it wants to know shared cognitive framing. We're learning psychology terms this week. It says shared cognitive framing is frameworks, beliefs, and assumptions that help us simplify a complicated reality. And so it's saying that, you know, NASA viewed their program as operational rather than experimental. Kind of some of the things that Angela and I were talking about, you know, that they didn't look at the risks anymore. But it's saying, what other evidence is there that this was a case of cognitive framing? So that this is a case that they looked at it as just operational without any risks.
I think a good example is, you know, they sent the rocket up, and then the next day they're looking at the launch pad and they find a humongous piece of foam, and they're looking at each other. Oh, yeah, it's just foam. I mean, sure, it's the biggest piece of foam we've ever found that's fallen off a piece of a rocket, but it's got to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I think another thing is just they kept trying to rationalize it, right? It was so expensive, and they said, oh, well, we'll rationalize it. We'll make multiple trips in these shuttles. That'll make it more economical. I think there was a lot of things where they were trying to continue their program when they didn't really have sufficient funding to keep it safe, right? They were making too many cuts.
Well, that's another good point is where was all the money going? Because this program was subsidized by the government, and then they had the contracts into the people that were setting stuff up in the shuttles. So it's like, where's all the money going? Because you've got other competitors that can do it without the government subsidy. So I think they should research that out.
I think it's just really expensive. I mean, they talk about NASA having 24,000 employees. That's a lot of people on the payroll. And then the equipment itself is really expensive. I think there's a lot of costs involved, and especially in everything they were trying to do. And they wanted to continue to do things even with the lower budget. And I think they should have relooked at their program and said, okay, we've got a little bit lower budget. What can we do within the framework of that budget, rather than saying, well, we have a lower budget, but we're just going to, you know, do more with less, when it wasn't really the safest decision to keep sending those same shuttles up and not relook at the design and try to make something better that wouldn't have that problem. All right, we have a few more questions. It says, when did the problems with Columbia begin?
Well, I kind of think that might have been always present because it was a maintenance problem. And one of the things that this article pointed out is corrosion and lack of maintenance. So probably day one.
Well, I think even before that, I'm trying to look in the case, but remember that first flight, they had that problem. The first mission back in April of 1981, they had to replace 300 tiles. Right, and then in January of 1990 on the Columbia, they had this second known left bipod ramp foam event. So they had another foam event then, and then in December, you know, so I think the foam problem had been going on since the beginning, since the first flight with that shuttle, and yet they kept just running the shuttle and decided it was an acceptable risk. So he said, so that kind of leads to the next question. It says, why did the debris strikes become an acceptable risk?
It's easier than addressing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So crazy. I think it started off small, and at first they were really going to look into it. They talked about it being a really big problem, but then they went ahead and ran another mission. I mean, that's what I didn't understand. When they couldn't figure it out, instead of continuing to work with it, they were so focused on their schedule that they went ahead and then they just reclassified it as being acceptable flight risk. So, oh, now I'm gonna go shut the door. My husband's alarm's going off. Let me go shut the door.
Well, we get to look at some paintings now, Angelo.
Sorry. My husband works nights, so he's just starting to wake up now. All right, so he says, what's the root of the situation here with the Columbia mission?
What was the what?
What is the root of the situation here with the Columbia mission? So what's the root problem?
Well, I tend to think there's a few different problems going on. I didn't see anyone that was really ambitious about doing any of the maintenance work or even any of the repair work. They had that one guy, he would instigate stuff, but even he fell short in a couple of areas. I forget his name. But and then like he was saying, the schedule. They were more interested in the schedule than the safety factors.
Well, it's funny. They would bring things up and say, "Oh, well, that's gonna affect our next launch date." But they weren't thinking about, well, how does it affect this mission? It was just, oh, it's gonna have to spend more time in the shop. So, I thought that was weird. So.
And it really makes me cringe to think that they intentionally did not tell the crew what was going on. So I think there was definite communication issues, if you want to call it secretism or deceit or whatever. But that, to me, that could have saved their lives right there. Because if you saw what happened in that Apollo mission, they told the crew, and then ground crew, Tiger team, and Apollo crew worked together to make some sort of contraption that fixed the shit. Well, and that could have been the solution here.
That's an interesting point that you bring up. I think in Apollo 13, the astronauts were aware of the problem because their instrumentation told them, right? So they were immediately aware. So there was no way it could be kept from them. So that might be another thing that played into this. I think you're right. The astronauts had no way of knowing that something had fallen off, that there was the foam strike. They had no way of knowing unless they were told, and they weren't told. And I think you're right that would have made a huge difference if it had been something where the astronauts knew there was a problem versus not having any idea. Well, it's sad. You have to wonder about the families of them.
I think they got a lawsuit case.
I'm sure they did. But I can't even imagine how horrible to know that, your spouse or your sister or your brother, was up in there and there was a problem and nobody did anything about it.
And just the overall negligence that would have. Yeah. I mean, I don't think you do a job like that without realizing there's some risk, but when it's just avoidable negligence, yeah.
What do you think?
I think something very dangerous in this case is to work under pressure. Kind of work that you must made with all the time you need. I think every risk have to be evaluated and è annullati.
I think you're right. A lot of times when we put so much pressure on ourselves, we don't think about the risks anymore. We're just pushing forward and ignoring some of those warning signs.
I think in this case, there are not the risks acceptable, because every risk are very dangerous.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, a thought just came to mind, and it might explain some of the mentality that was going on. Every time they send a bird up, it's either millions of dollars of income to them or even $1 billion worth of income to them. Now, suppose they got their schedule and they're making billions of dollars in a year. They don't want to let one of those contracts go. But there are thousands of people in the astronaut program.
Yeah, I was surprised. 24,000 employees, that's crazy. That's a lot of people.
And back in 2003, $1 billion, that's a lot of money. So, when you're looking at, gee, I got thousands of personnel, but only so many billions coming in every year, it kind of explains perhaps the mentality of some of the people there.
So I think that kind of leads into the next question a little bit as we're talking about the people at NASA. It says, how would you characterize the culture at NASA, and to talk about some strengths as well as the weaknesses? So what do you think we've talked a lot about the weaknesses and a lot of the problems. What are some strengths about the culture at NASA? Are there strengths? Silence?
A proud history.
I think at some point you have to be willing to move forward, right? So I think they take that to an extreme. It would be really easy to be crippled and to never send anybody up because of the risks involved. So I think that could have been something that was good, but it kind of got twisted into something that was bad because it was taken too far. Their partnerships, right? They partnered with some other good companies. They had a lot of research, but then they didn't want to communicate with each other, so I don't know that helped. It's hard to come up with strengths. How about weaknesses? What are the weaknesses out there at NASA's culture?
Lack of assertiveness.
Okay. Yeah, I like that one guy. He typed up that email that was very assertive and very clear, and then he didn't send it.
But her presented as evidence. Yes, I was doing my job.
I thought that was really strange. I think that's the problem with the culture, is that they didn't feel like they could say anything. They thought they would be seen as Chicken Little if they brought something up. So.
True.
And it talked in the case about the bureaucracy, right? They had to follow the exact path, but this DAT team wasn't really given a part of that. So how could they follow when they weren't given a line of authority at all? It's like they set them up for failure.
True. It also said in there that the engineers did not feel like they could talk to the upper rank.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And it sounds like maybe in the past the upper rank had blown off the engineers prior to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, we talk about that in the book we read, The Strength of Trust. That was called Speed of Trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked how he talked about watch people how they treat the waiters, right? Because you've got to treat everybody really well and not just ignore a whole group of people or write them off. I love the part where it talked about on the business exam for her business class in college. The question was, what's the name of your housekeeper? Right, and she didn't think that was important. And I think NASA might buy into that mentality of, oh, those are the engineers and we're not going to worry about them or talk with them. And it's so important that everybody feel like they're an important part of the organization and that they're going to be listened to.
True. I remember reading in the case also the head lady in charge. At one point, she realized what the problem was, and her response was, well, they're already in space now. It's too late to do anything.
Yeah, a couple of people said that. Well, what are we going to do at this point? And I thought, well, that's kind of rude. You could try to figure something out.
Well, 7 lives just got wrote off pretty easy, huh?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that was crazy. Especially because I love that you just came up with a solution, right? Have them sit there and send a new shuttle up for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's crazy. So we're kind of talking about the next question a little bit too. It says, tell me about the people in the case that were important contributors to this mission's failure. So one of them, definitely the lady in charge, who just wrote it off as, we can't do anything anyway. But who are some of the other people? What do you think, Angela? We haven't heard from you in a little bit. Who do you think were some of the people that contributed to the failure?
The contribute to the failure, I think primarily the Congress,
Mm.
because the space mission was under pressure. I think this is the most relevant problem in this case. But when we work under pressure, we work bad, I think.
Yeah. I think that's good to bring the broader scope and not just look at the people at NASA.
Also there were many technical errors. Primarily, I think the problem is the pressure.
I think they were all feeling that pressure. So we had the boss lady, I can't remember her name either. She was kind of a contributor. That engineer who wrote the email but then didn't send it. I think the fact that just whoever set up the DAT team, and they didn't really say who, but whoever they made the decision to set up a DAT team instead of a Tiger team. Right? Mission control not telling the astronauts that there was a potential large problem.
There was something that in the communication. I think during the mission, maybe the like I can see during the mission, I think the astronauts could repair the wings, the wing. I don't remember how can say the l'ala, come si dice l'ala? The wing, yes, wing. I think that wing could be repaired during the mission.
Mm-hmm.
But they were concentrated to conclude the mission in time.
Yeah.
They could repair during the mission. I think was more important to repair than to conclude the mission.
That should have been the priority, right?
Mm.
Yeah. So then, here's an interesting question. It says, who is accountable and why?
Who is what?
Who is accountable?
Who's
Who's
responsible?
blamed? Yeah, who's responsible?
Well, I think enough of the top people in the situation, like we talked about the lady and a couple of the other guys that were working with her, had basically written the mission but before it had even landed or attempted to land. Because like she said, well, the shuttle's already up there, can't do anything now. That's a write-off.
Yeah.
And then, they're finding bits of shuttle. Basically, that foam is bits of shuttle on the launch pad. It's like, no one's going to do anything about that. And even the engineers, I mean, they know that that was an unacceptable amount of foam to be laying there on the launch pad. And while they did voice concern, they didn't drive that concern home sufficiently, or at least send the email. So, yeah, I think there's a general organization responsibility.
Yeah. Then I think our last question is just asking if there are any principles from this week's reading that we can apply to this case. So this week we started reading the new book about the team, the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Do you see any application from that? I think that one's hard because it's more like a story, and we've just started reading the story. So how do we think we can apply that to this case?
Well, I think don't get complacent. I mean, especially if you've got a position that lives are depending on you, but even if you don't have a position where lives are depending on you, do your job fully and don't take the situation for granted.
And I think if they've been put together more as a team instead of being kind of siloed, like the DAT team was in its own silo and the mission control, the engineers, they were all kind of doing their own thing. They weren't brought together as a team. I think had they been working as a team more, maybe they would have had better communication, come up with a solution instead of just writing it off.
Well, they kind of had their own collection of little teams doing their own thing, and each of the teams would take a turn pointing the finger at the other one.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a situation of too many teams. You can over-team something.
I think when the teams are siloed like that, right, and you're right, they're all adversarial and pointing at each other rather than actually working together. Instead of being one large team working together to solve the problem, they were all these different little teams with their different takes on what was going on. So
I think Angela was about to say something.
Oh,
I think story teach us something. I think because uh, from this story we can better how we can evaluate the priorities and how we can improve some maybe the communication because the some communication I think could be better. Overall, I think we can learn to better evaluate the priorities. Is in our mission, in the space mission, but in our mission, in our ev- um, uh, daily life, we can evaluate the priorities and we can work better, I think.
I think you're right. That's a great way to apply it to our own personal lives. That sometimes we get caught up in our schedule and in what we're doing and in our what we think is the priority, and we lose track of what's really important. That's a good point. So, anything else? Any other final comments or anything about this case?
Here is night. In Italy, now is night. You dark.
I think the only thing I'd add is they should have created or designed an escape pod on the plane. Might have
Yeah,
changed things a whole lot.
that would have been smart. So, does anybody know? Are they? I haven't heard anything about any shuttles recently. Have they done any shuttles? Have they had any launches of actual astronauts going up since this one?
I've heard of them sending people to the space station, but I know that they've discontinued the Apollo landings on the moon and have limited stuff. I think this day and age it's more just sending up satellites, and a lot of that they can do robotically.
Yeah, I think I like that they're able to do that so that we don't have to risk lives again.
I'm sure.
So. All right, well, I think that wraps up our discussion. And Elisa's in charge next week, so we'll see you guys next week.
Alrighty.
I'll email out the link. So,
Okay, cool.
all right, see you next Saturday.
All right, have a good week.
You too. Bye.
Thank you.